Our speaker is, of course, Dr. Joshua Comaroff, who is an assistant professor in urban studies at Yale-NUS College. So he will be presenting on the topic Singapore post-nature. So Josh, I think, who will share screen with us now.
Okay, I'll just go ahead and share screen now. Okay, great.
Yes,
so
it is.
I have to apologize. I have been caught by the influenza that is currently tearing its way through Singapore's primary and secondary schools. So I will try to be as coherent and more importantly, as non-squeaky as I can be with frequent sips of warm water, et cetera. But I would like to warmly thank Wan Ling for the invitation to speak in this virtual seminar series today. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to engage with a community in Singapore studies. After finishing my doctoral work many years ago, I spent more than a decade working actually not as an academic researcher, but rather as a practicing designer, working for NParks and JTC and other organizations in the hopes of contributing to this national environment in an interesting moment of tentative steps taken sort of beyond the garden city concept. A less happy result of this was that until recently, I've gotten to meet and interact mainly with practitioners and less so with students or with scholars who I know almost exclusively through their publications. So I appreciate very much this chance to join in the conversation today. It was also a very timely invitation as I've recently been thinking a great deal about the value of studying Singapore. A series of frankly frustrating discussions with editors at American presses have highlighted to me repeatedly the idea that our context is too often seen elsewhere to represent a kind of niche interest, right? A dangerously small readership for academic books. And I was reminded recently of Manuel Castell's and colleagues' description of Singapore from 1990 as sui generis, right? And this echoes certain critical official discourses of Singaporean exceptionalism, of uniqueness, and perhaps contributes to the idea of the city-states as a kind of extreme circumstance. As a result, there is the potential for work here to be seen as a kind of argument made from marginal cases, the sort of idiographic condition without generalizable insights. At least publishing books about Singapore was described to me very recently as quote unquote unsustainable in light of present market conditions for scholarly monographs. And while I agree that there is much to be said for Singapore's particularity and identity as a multicultural society, as a political system, an environment, and most importantly, a place. I've also felt that we do share historical experiences with a broader world and that the world has something to learn from us. And here I kind of find myself in this somewhat embarrassing company of neoliberal journalists, the kind of economist boosters who talk about London as Singapore on the Thames, right? Or who propose Singaporean approaches to European or American problems. And this is not at all the spirit of what I mean to say today. However, my belief, and this may be nothing new to many of you, remains that there are aspects of Singapore's colonial experience and post-colonial story that position the nation more as a paradigmatic case, as a lens for understanding the coming stages of powerfully emergent global trends. But also not least, as Daniel Goh at NUS has pointed out, that this is a nation where modernization and development have been centralized within the identity of the post-colonial state, perhaps even more than, say, in the cases of Frantz Fanon, the rediscovery of older kind of authentic cultural practices, arts, or spiritual beliefs. So Singapore has always put tremendous energy into the imagination of speculative futures and in the robust political theology of modernization as self-making. At the same time, there's also been a quite vigorous exploration of the illiberal potentials of democratic systems, which other nations now seem increasingly to be drifting towards. This has not been lost on academics either. Slavoj Žižek famously argued that Singapore is one of two futures for advanced capital, and Rem Koolhaas has made similar arguments about urban planning and governments when he's imagining the Netherlands in the coming century. I'd like to speak to this today, though, in a slightly different register, and through the apparently kind of straightforward, maybe banal, certainly grounded instance of landscape. And this is due to a factor that's not unique, but perhaps is unusual, particularly thorough and ruthless exposure of Singapore's geobody to extractive colonial biocapitalism. And at the same time, projections of a physically and morally harmful equatorial climate carried on well through independence have justified a radically aggressive, even sometimes militaristic approach to transforming Singapore's landscape into a spectacle of domestication, like we see here, or of productive use. And here, the perceptive and very early instrumentalization of the landscape within PAP governmentality has also justified a very anthropogenic order with little place for undesigned ecologies. So I'll argue today that these factors have in fact kind of turned our environmental clock forward to a future stage of both environmental crisis and response. I believe that despite national branding that foregrounds sustainable urban design, we stand considerably farther into the realm of landscape futures, ones which are shaped in large part by climate emergency. And this might be alarming for us, but it also presents, I believe, an opportunity to understand the possible futures of landscape in this anxious new age. Now, while lauded globally for its famous greenness, Singapore is in fact, for example, experiencing warming effects, the notorious heat island syndrome, actually at a rate that is 2.5 times faster than the global average. Native species today stand at less than 15% of what existed at the outset of the 19th century, and are even further at risk from plants that today are being selected for qualities of hardiness, for speed of growth, or even simply for aesthetic charm. And while spectacular efforts are made to plant trees and shrubs, we are experiencing an aggregate loss of environmentally active areas, or put another way, habitats are gradually being replaced with greenery. Why is this significant? I mean, apart from the kind of immediate urgency of crisis, I believe it is so because we can identify here not merely effects, but a variety of emergent contradictions or principles that are coming to define the characteristics of new natural environments in an anthropogenic age more generally. It's meaningful also, I think, because it demands consideration of both ethical and effective action on the part of us, of humans, who for better or worse are enmeshed increasingly in ongoing interactions with the species and relations of our natural settings. This is a consideration that can take us away from perhaps other unhelpful fantasies of the moment, like rewilding or renativization, or even perhaps worse, of quote unquote sustainable design. What I'll present today is just a small part of developing research that attempts to adopt Singapore's natural conditions as a viewpoint for finding more precise ways to understand common characteristics of the natural within what is now often referred to as the Anthropocene. It's actually a term I find rather difficult to work with, as it's been kind of generalized to the point of including almost any kind of anthropogenic effect or repercussion thereof in the present moment. It's perhaps kind of ironic that a term that began as a very narrow definition, a recognition in scientific taxonomy of human effects as central to geological conditions, now stands simply for kind of any aspect of an amorphous crisis. I've chosen post-natures instead to describe these new conditions and relations. The very insightful ecologist, Richard Corlett, who is at our Center for Urban Greenery and Ecology here, has recommended a term ecologies. He's not alone in the use of that. I have concerns about that approach, though, as it kind of seems to foreground a kind of adaptive coevolution of species into new arrangements as a condition that will produce eventually new ecosystems to replace old ones. By contrast, I feel that this quite dramatically downplays crisis factors of temporality, and I feel also that it decenters the necessary and real responsibilities of humans as actors within the fragmentary processes that now characterize environments like Singapore. And I'll consider this role a bit more toward the end of this presentation. So for today, I'm going to focus more on the present character of the nation's environment than on the details of its emergence, its history, which is very complex and in some cases highly localized. So rather than get into the weeds, so to speak, we might say that the accelerated transformation of Singapore's landscape into what is today an almost totally anthropogenic condition has been chiefly driven by two central discourses. The first was a colonial understanding of the island as an entirely productive mechanism, at least in potential. The very, very profitable work of British settlers was understood as the improvement of a squalid and unproductive jungle into a garden, a setting where the powerful energetic forces of the equatorial environment would translate into lucre, the fast and bountiful production of agricultural products, and also industrial inputs like rubber. In this sense, the so-called plantation-ocene took over the limited land area very, very quickly and competed with urban settlement and with migratory population growth in clearing the dipterocarp forest. This was very, very sudden in our case, and its effects have been largely permanent. The vast majority of native plant species were already extirpated by the turn of the 20th century, and in the same period, most of our coastal mangrove was cleared for prawn farming. At the same time, the British policy of acclimatization meant that plants from other humid and even temperate zones had been introduced to Singapore, either for profit or for intended beautification. The second factor here was an imaginary of danger and unhealth associated with the quote-unquote jungle, a kind of amorphous conceptual complex that carried only negative connotations of threat and miasma and social degradation. This was hardly unique to Singapore, of course, but the notion of the tropical as a force that was antithetical to development or to progressive action was something that in our case carried on well past independence. I've written elsewhere about these ideas with respect to the idea of humid air, which really vexed the British and which LKY later described as soporific and as the principal threat to modernization and development. Areas of forest were seen as similarly recrudescent forces, although it's interesting to note that much of the so-called jungle that stood at independence was in fact post-disturbance landscape left over by cyclical crisis of agribusiness in the late 19th and early 20th century. But these two general discourses were dramatically developed in the Garden City Initiative. In fact, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that they were weaponized after independence. And LKY, in fact, described the landscape as my secret weapon, right? I'm quoting him here, saying that he wanted visitors and foreign leaders to see well-maintained lawns and shrubs when they visited him in the Astana. In his study of landscape planning in Singapore, Edmund Waller wrote that the presence of the state in public landscape and infrastructure projects became much clearer retrospectively at Lee's speech to the Singapore Press Club in August of 1996, shown here. The Prime Minister noted that this became a certain subtle way of convincing investors that Singapore was an efficient and effective place. And this in turn suggested that the government could manage the place, could get things done, and meet the company's infrastructure requirements. And this was made extremely clear at the level of national symbolism. The Istana grounds were beautified with a miniature landscaped Japanese garden with bonsai at the entrance. So this micromanagement has formed an index and an instrument of the nation's transition, in the famous phrase from Third World First. For this reason, our former NParks chief exec, Tan Wee Kiat, used to often joke that he was the only gardener in the world who reports directly to the Prime Minister's office. So the detail of this intention to landscape makes for a very particular approach to the creation of national space. But there's more to this. The Singaporean methods embody a much broader political ethos concerning the natural environment and how it relates also to the management of human society. And this is where landscape is not merely an instrumental practice or a channel of propaganda, say, aimed at foreign leaders and executives. It becomes a kind of political ideology. Politics is seen here to encompass the total ongoing calibration of the natural environment. Now, the maintenance of the Garden City is a way to experiment with and extend the capacity of the state to manage this total environment. And also it gives us a very clear feedback mechanism when the state is somehow not working as it should. As Lee himself noted, as a wonderful quote, he said, "You can't just plant a tree and walk away. The tree will die. You need tree doctors. You need to understand what sound and how much sunlight it requires. It's a very complex thing that all people who run big organizations will understand." In keeping here with the theorization of Sheldon Wolin, the political begins to assume the form in the literal sense of a culture, that is, a cultivating, a tending, taking care of beings and of things. And this attention really didn't flag. NPark officials today still joke that throughout his career, Lee was driven around anonymously at night to check on the state of the parks and the roadside plantings and the estate lawns to make sure that they were being very well tended. So this emphasis of Lee's on landscape will be very well known, I think, to this audience. But there are interesting factors of nature and materiality to consider here also. The effectiveness of landscape as a feedback mechanism is heightened by the character of the medium itself as an artificial and invented version of tropical ecology. The plantings of the Garden City don't form historically co-adapted communities. The planting beds of the roadsides only exist together where they have been placed, and their balance, that is the fact of one species not driving the other out, is attributable to the maintenance of the National Parks Board. This is why our public landscape is a heavily interventionist one, requiring continual maintenance to prevent certain species from invading or outcompeting others. Because they are not co-adapted from a common system, these arrangements of plants cannot exist in a stable balance. It's a landscape that simply can't survive without the constant attention of the government as a gardener. It is, we could say, intentionally non-sustainable. And each of these planted communities requires the state as a mediating force. And this also has to do with a particular method of planting, which we can see here. I mean, what's very interesting, given its kind of phantasmal aspects, is that this national landscape of Singapore at each scale has a certain coherent look to it. It has a clear aesthetic. There's a logic to the way that it's put together, which we can read in this image. And as we can see here in this typical planting plan, right, plants are corralled into these monospecial groups that are placed side by side. Here, public landscape was heavily influenced by the design of landscape at early hospitality and condominium complexes, in particular by the Hawaiian designers Belt Collins and Associates at the Shangri-La Hotel and elsewhere. And this was described at the time, and I'm quoting the landscape architects here, as controlled jungle characterized by large groupings of plants into masses of the same species. If we look at a plan, it's something like this. It attempts a kind of curvilinear naturalism or organicism, right? Nature is represented through the use of free-form geometries. But in fact, this is very alien to the tropical landscape, which is actually much more intermeshed, right? Plants of differing species tend to intermingle not in these stands or clumps or groups, but also on a specimen by specimen basis, right? They don't separate themselves out laterally by species, but they do so vertically in trophic layers. In fact, never and nowhere in the design national landscape do plants mingle at the level of specimen. And an interesting element of this broader Singaporean landscape, particularly in projects of state, public fronting ones like the one we see here, is a tendency to unify through a process of kind of radical or unmediated juxtaposition, which is a fact that is very aesthetically striking when you encounter Singapore for the first time as an outsider. There's a kind of subtle or collage-like quality to the environment. A local architect described this to me as national landscape as hothouse, right, wherein many, many elements are placed that nonetheless never quite achieve the impression of a synthetic unity. She noted, you have species from Asia, South America, Africa. Initially, what you see is a huge profusion of plants with large numbers of species in each roadside planting. It's like a botanical garden approach, but when you become more familiar, you realize that none of them match and that they're completely non-compatible. So they're like botanical collections in the British colonial tradition, merely gardens of will. And they represent an interest in taxonomy, a careful attention to administration, as opposed to an ecological realism. And Lee likewise noted the influence of the colonial botanical tradition, particularly of this project we see, observing that the British had, quote, done the basics for the Singapore landscape in providing the botanical gardens established in 1859. And this became highly visible, I think, in a very compelling way during the pandemic and during the so-called circuit breaker. Many of us noticed images like this, that, when all the famously neat and close cropped lawns were left alone, they very quickly became wildflower meadows. As insects became less easy prey, all of those ubiquitous, what we call in Singapore, pest birds, right? The mynas and the other species were much less prevalent because they had less to eat. We saw more butterflies and moths skimming the surface of these long grasses, as that highly fragile monoculture did not have the biweekly attentions of these guys, right, to keep them physically and visually pure. Our guest workers primarily are responsible for the act of clearing, that challenge that anthropologist Anna Tsing has described as the fundamental Western preoccupation of selecting for certain species who are understood to belong and keeping others out. And as I think we know all too well, this is a perpetual campaign. Right? Surrounding greenery continually threatens the apertures of a garden, and the famous kind of historical negativity of the jungle in imagination is kind of nightmare of anti-civilizing, anti-urbanizing force is always ready to kind of reassert itself at a moment's notice. So pioneering flora encroach around the edges, airborne weeds take root, et cetera, et cetera. So the threat of humans actually here is more than just aesthetic, including pests, including disease vectors such as mosquitoes and dengue fever, which opportunistically enter these areas that have become neglected, and they thrive due to a lack of robust predation. As we know, nature famously abhors a vacuum. So the breach of this garden, right, can remain only so long as great numbers of crews and technicians are dedicated daily and weekly to its subjugation. Weeds can recolonize turf in less than 48 hours. Site perimeters of shrub and vine have a tendency to contract and have to be pushed back. Right. And in this, there's really a preference for heavy machinery, for mechanical trimmers and blowers, chainsaws and atomizers for distributing oils and gases and fog, as we see being done here. Trucks of workers arrive dressed, as we know, in these orange cloaks and these headscarves and sunglasses. And again, to the uninitiated, their appearance can be kind of alarming, applying discipline to this kind of recidivist thicket. The Singaporean gardening takes on a kind of overtly militaristic aspect. And we can see here, just this is 100 meters from where I'm sitting now. This is what happens when the gardeners do not get to work. This is a planting at UTown campus at NUS in the week after the circuit breaker. And what we see here is that the plants are not keeping politely to their notional boundaries of their monospecial clumps. In fact, rather, they're beginning to interdigitate. And the look of this intersection makes it immediately clear that these have not been tended, right? That the program of maintenance has somehow fallen into a lapse. So across UTown, the aftermath of that period was clearing these interlopers, systematically kind of separating out those groups again. And these had just casually begun to sort of grow together. But once the process has begun, it's actually very difficult to untangle and very labor intensive to maintain. And if left entirely alone, landscapes tend to grow toward conditions like the one that we see here. This is a typology of urban site that's left intentionally to extreme overgrowth that we find at sites that are held by URA for future tender or around military camps or securitized areas in the public sphere. And this practice clearly avoids the burden of maintenance, but it also prevents unwanted squatting, unsanctioned activity by rendering them in effect completely uninhabitable. By agreement, these spaces are only maintained by NParks at their very perimeter to avoid encroachment upon neighbors. So as a result, these green spaces are wildly unpredictable, and one doesn't really know how the species will co-evolve over time. Many introduced plants, as we know, are non-invasive, while others, like the trumpet vine that we see here festooning these trees, will begin to cover and colonize nearly everything around them. And while we don't know the path that this kind of landscape will take in its development, we pretty much know the eventual outcome. And this is a case where the diversity of species on this site will eventually collapse to very few because the vines will create uninhabitable conditions for a majority of the other plants. It's interesting to note here that this kind of convulsive crypto jungle also serves as a reminder quite powerfully of what will happen if the gardener fails to maintain the designed territoriality of the garden city. But it also illustrates a first contradiction of the post-natural. And this is a kind of cyclical dependence whereby human intervention of various kinds, what's actually anthropogenesis in the landscape, produces conditions requiring increasingly more human intervention. As ecologists have pointed out, In other ecosystems, disturbance must be managed in order to restrain or minimize further damaging effects. And as we see in Singapore's case, and as Lee astutely recognized in the landscape that his administration inherited, there's little opportunity for disengagement. The garden has a tendency to trap the gardener in an unending and ever-expanding tenure. Again, this occurs in large part because these species have a very short history in ecological time of cohabitation. A key understanding of the urban equatorial landscape is that while dense and often lush, it's full of fragmented interactions and broken processes. Ecologists and horticulturalists have studied the many effects of these, right, downstream to flash flooding, to vulnerability to invasive species, or the failure of native plants to reproduce, which I'll show in a moment. I won't go into any of these in any great detail, but rather what I'm trying to register here is a fundamental contradiction of many landscapes of human origin. And flora and fauna are also evolved. So what this means, for example, is that we might have issues of reproduction and propagation, or we may have trees that the birds simply don't want to nest in. So, for example, Richard Corlett had observed that our native sunbirds cannot pollinate heliconia plants, which are not native to Singapore, because unlike the hummingbirds that tend to them in South America, our sunbirds don't pollinate while hovering. Right, as we can see on the lower right, this is the sunbird is trying to kind of stand on the projection in order to get its beak into the petal. And heliconia now, as a result, need humans to breed and to replant them because the sunbird can't stand there and thus can't get its beak inside. And this is a perfect example of a broken process. Of course, this is completely illegible, and the anthropogenic dependence of the plant is unknown to most of us outside the gardening industry, which depends on a high replacement rate of these kinds of plants for profitability. As an aside, this is how we deal with this at our house, just a kind of home photo. We have a little platform like a bird feeder, and we took a little strip of leftover basswood, something that would degrade over time, and we made a little kind of bow tie. And this is a obviously highly anthropogenic solution to an anthropogenic problem, right? Which is a paradox that I will return to in a moment. And we can see here a second contradiction of the post-natural, and this is the shift of the landscape away from the relational aspects of the natural, the quiet loss of a vast and to most largely invisible infrastructure of interactions among species in a long co-evolved ecosystem that allows for the health and the survival of that system. And this is the famous trope of the web, right, of nature popularized by Rachel Carlson and other significant figures from scientific ecology of the 1960s. But this network allows for the survival of fauna, which allow for balanced populations and prevent, for example, swarms of dengue-carrying mosquitoes, and which allow for propagation and for the management of sun and from water. And while these interactions are not physical things, they are nonetheless real in much the same way that Durkheim described society as real. And to extend this possibly inappropriate anthropocentric metaphor, but further, what we see in the post-natural is the rise of a series of anomic conditions in which the various species lack effective relations with others that then cause damage to the broader system. And what arises through this fragmentation is a proliferation of small and unseen, but crucial gaps, which, barring the nearly impossible events of some kind of systematic reconstitution of ecosystems, require human intervention. The example of the sunbird and the heliconias is one such gap, which in my case required the solution of a kind of prosthesis, which I have no doubt some people might find very perverse and very unsustainable. But regardless, the possibilities of interaction are what separate a viable ecosystem from one that requires continuous human support. These also are what allow for the mitigation of system-wide environmental failure. So the second contradiction, the presence of nature that does not operate as nature, that is, of species that do not interact but remain in effective isolation, gives rise to a third, which is embodied throughout Singapore's approach to sustainability. And this is the contradiction of quantity. In fact, in post-natural context, there's often a great deal of emphasis placed upon quantity. In fact, quantification becomes a misleading proxy by which the health of an environment is judged. We often hear, for example, that Singapore has planted 2 million trees, now actually even more, since 1963, or has a biodense national landscape, or 4,200 species of vascular flora, for example, or that the URA, in a slightly different register, requires the total green area of an empty plot to be replicated within or around a building, which is then built on top of that plot. This is so-called 100% replacement. The claim made for this building, for example, which promoted itself as being the tallest vertical greening scheme in the world, again, a quantitative appeal, is that it is the equivalent of 2,743 square meters of rainforest. This can only be the result of a quantitative calculation, for example, of, say, leaf area index or equivalent multiplied by the surface area of the facade, right? And when transposed into an ecosystem service model to a process, something like presumably air filtration. There's simply no way that this vertical carpet replaces the functioning ecosystem of the Diptera carp forest of that size, or its fauna, for example, which are obviously absent. Similar claims are made for biodiversity, which is often mistaken for simply profusion of species, right? In fact, meaningful biodiversity doesn't merely mean the number of species present in a space. It means the diversity of species that are capable of interacting in a common self-propagating system. Often ecosystems experience a peak in diversity, a very dramatic peak, immediately before a catastrophic collapse. So what we see here is kind of market logic, older notions of the ecosystemic, of a system of interactions, of cooperations or predations even, has been replaced in the contemporary moment by a logic of quantity. And here, value, just translated into the rubric of the sustainable, is equated with amount or substance or biomass. Right. And the ironic consequence of this assumption is that no matter how much more is added, the invisible and relational character of the ecosystem will never be reconstituted. So while having the overwhelming effect of appearing green, again, a term that is usefully ambiguous, such provision represents only a mass of non-interacting components. It's very important to note that this is not merely an effect of greenery, that is, of flora. Right. The problematic and deceptive character of anthropogenic landscapes is a much broader and repetitive syndrome that occurs at multiple scales and within different environmental categories. The non-relational quality of much of our planting, the fact that it's made of real substance but performs in the collective in the manner of a simulacrum, has analogous conditions in our earth also. What we see here is one of those wonderful, great stockpiles of sand used to expand our shoreline and then eventually to house, economic infrastructures like petrochemical storage or processing. Increasingly, our new coastline is reserved for such large-scale operations, and these require vast flat zones. Not all of them are for logistics or industry. Others, such as Marina Bay, right, are now planted with lawn and being gradually developed with new architectures. And it's very interesting to think through these territories of sand and gravel, particularly if we imagine sand as against, say, land, a hugely complex and emotive conceptual category, or terroir, or more simply just against soil, which, as we can see here in one of many classification systems. Soil, for example, is a structured admixture of minerals, ashes and stones, with decaying organic matter, provides nutritive and mechanical support for plants, and it's a system that incorporates air and water differentially across aerobic and anaerobic zones and levels. And it's by far the most biodiverse ecosystem on Earth, mainly due to its microbial richness. Soil is differentiated by organic matter and layering and microstructures that come from, again, slow interactions with the flora above and the minerals of the insects below. And this means that soils are highly idiographic. There are thousands upon thousands of named soils, in fact, tens of thousands of named soils. And soil scientists and agriculturalists, being self-professed soil geeks, like to be able to know and identify as many of them as they can. In fact, some can even identify them by taste, by rolling a little clod of earth around in their mouths. And what they are tasting there, in effect, is a kind of ecological temporality, right? Soils evolve very slowly and via intensive interaction with the entirety of a climate, with species, with stone, with weather. When we look at sand at new ground, however, we see something very different. Sand is composed of tiny uniform crystalline particles which do not cohere and which must be aggregated in an entirely different way. And this produces a particular kind of expression here by contrast in the coast, which we can see immediately from satellite imagery. This is in Jurong. Again, this is a petrochemical platform. Tuas at the left was constructed around an existing spit of land, and there's a kind of formalization of the existing irregular landmass into a kind of clear geometrical figure here. In fact, much of Singapore's expanded coast has this similar signature. It's clear that this new edge is highly geometrical, has a very fixed boundary with an enormous degree of abstraction and at a very high scale. This is not, for example, a small system of inlets. Is diametrically opposed to the intricate porosity and complexity of coastal earth, say like a mangrove edge, which does not have a continuous line, but rather a series of absorbent matrices at increasingly small sizes. And this here is designed for logistical criteria, right? Large ships loading and unloading, open air storage on a flat table. And in the case of Jurong, this is largely the holding of liquid chemicals and fuels. It has a shape and size that is derived from container shipping and the technologies of scale and efficiency, short times and very high volumes that arise from this economy. This new form of coast also arises from a problem of containment, right? Of defending sand against the sea, and also from the threat of sea level rise. This is not a beach, right? Which, as Paul Carter and others have noted, is characterized by an ambiguous, ever-shifting series of configurations and relations with plants and other organisms, right? The coast in Jurong does not allow for the colonization of life or for ecological interaction. It's largely inert and, in fact, architectural. And we can see that in its geography, right, in those vast hieroglyphic figures, it's territory, but it's not land. And Charles Lim has documented in his sea state research the anxious kind of technical legal process that piles of sand undergo before they can be officially declared as part of the Singaporean landmass. The result conforms to what we've seen before, the kind of peculiar absent presence, right? This is ground, but it's sterile. It has no recognizable identity, being, even under a microscope, largely the same as piled sand elsewhere. It does not even, in fact, hold water terribly well. And it's a good example of what Iwa Ong has called the urbanism of the volumetric, right? It's defined almost entirely by the technopolitics of quantity. Here also, we see evidence of the fourth and the last contradiction that I'd like to discuss today, and this is a disjointed or dual temporality. This is characterized on the one hand by hyperfluidity, of instantaneousness, the sheer speed at which territory of sand can be built, and the fact that, unlike land, it could be constructed at the rate of architecture or of infrastructure to meet a pressing economic demand. It's very quickly shifted with human help. As I've written about elsewhere, media accounts of sand smuggling have described entire beaches and small islands disappearing overnight, right? This is said of some Riau islets that were lost very, very quickly. For example, we can see here with images of Nipau Island, or what was kind of formerly Nipau Island. This is what it was on the left and what it is on the right. These two ortho photos are annotated by Galen Pardee and as part of his ongoing research. And an extensive shoreline can be dismantled or built now in a matter of weeks or months, and can, as Miles Powell has compellingly analyzed, completely change the longstanding historical relationship between a people and their coastline. So enormous transformative social violence can be enacted relatively quickly. And then incongruously, there's a totally opposite assumption of time, right? Permanence of land as part of a sovereign national entity. And this is something we want to keep in mind when we consider this new territory that outlines Singapore. Once the material arrives here, it does lose its fluidity, becomes atemporal effectively through both technical and legal procedures. And again, this engineered coastline is the polar opposite of a beach. It's not subject to tides. It does not move. It has virtually no interface with the water, being mediated in most cases by concrete. The sand does not play its conventional ecological role, but rather operates as a kind of a neutral filler or a content. So while radically new, it's immediately subject to a kind of imaginary of permanence. It's taken out of time, and in this inherent aspect is negated. So it's important to understand that the resulting space here makes no compromise with time in the human sense of the word, right? No conventional human activities or rituals are enacted in the space. It's only really there for abstract labor that is heavily assisted by machinery. I've been here. It's fascinating. It's almost impossible to walk from one end to the other. One needs to be transported or to move, as we see this woman here, by bicycle, because the scale of operations are just gigantic compared to the human body. Nothing that the worker does here registers with any kind of lasting trace on the environment. So rather, the coast is now imagined as a kind of static substrate, right? A kind of permanent fact that enables the calculation of time as simply inputs to a larger, more complex series of procedures of production and distribution, of refining and transshipment. The peculiar speed that the kind of brevity, the temporalities of the geometric coastline are notable, I think, in particular with respect to rates of geological change, right? This is why they're very much representative often of accounts of Anthropocene time more generally. This is principally characterized by a temporal paradox. While built with alarming speed, these anthropogenic effects are characterized by a certain permanence or post-temporal character. And we can see this with the mass dissemination of so-called forever chemicals, something that's very much in the news of late, plastics and other products with long lifespans, even by geological standards. Permanence can be seen also in these massive earthworks and concrete and steel infrastructures like our coastline, which would outlive the human race in some form for eons. So the distinction between here, the instantaneous and its permanent externalities is very much central to these productive and temporal contradictions of late capital. Now, and I feel that this is very important. Such images are drawn from our own kind of emergent post-natures, right? But what we see here are merely Singaporean instances of a much larger and broader global logic, which worryingly, I think, animates a crisis that despite being highly visible, often suffers from a kind of problematics of legibility. That is, both the problems and the proffered solutions are frequently misrecognized and misrepresented. And here, the contradiction of the quantitative is a clear example, right? The emergencies of extinction and carbon capture are seen as the loss of mass substance and not the relations that such a substance animates. And that the solution is merely to compensate in amount, right? This is, after all, the logic of that carbon credit marketization that increasingly appears to do very little. It's a logic that also allows for the representation of Singapore as a solutionist state that is able to solve a crisis of development through exemplary consumption, say more trees, more leaves, and more planting. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to return to this kind of very arresting image, the one that's appeared in the announcement for this talk. I believe that this image can be read in two very different ways, with perhaps contrasting consequences for how we see the significance of Singapore in the world. Most easily, this looks like yet another kind of impressive, but perhaps almost comic kind of representation of how thoroughly the state has forced nature to kind of perform to its will. We have kind of here imperial echoes of French topiary, a kind of divine sovereignty over nature. At the back, and on the high level, we have a park placed improbably in the sky and forced to merge with an architecture that is itself a kind of feat of technical and numerical manipulation. But at the same time, this is all set within the virtuous frame of the apparently sustainable, right? An urban park that is one of the world's largest investments in urban green, characterized by our wonderful cyborg super trees that are claimed to filter the air. The integration of the Sky Park even into MBS is the basis of its claim as a Green Mark Award laureate, among other elements, right? This is the overtly anthropogenic gesture of cryptic kind of animals here is not necessarily one of perversity, but a kind of display of virtuosic entente between a kind of wounded nature and a well-meaning human administration. At the same time, however, I think we can read other emergent problems, right, of appearance and behavior, of quantity and relation, of interventionism and retreat, and of wildly contradictory scales of time and space, which illustrate with a kind of Singaporean brio a broader series of translocal challenges. And at the same time, again, we can locate here clear signs of a dominant ethos that has not been lost in the increasing decades since independence. And this is the notion that our engagement with those processes that we have disrupted is an ongoing, indeed possibly endless one, and that we cannot and will not stop playing the roles of a gardener. This crisis is worrying, of course, but I also find a kind of tentative promise in that last image. At least I prefer that kind of orientation toward the awkward and unsettled human-made nature, as opposed to this sort of increasing approach that aestheticizes failed interactions within the imaginary of, say, the spectral or the monstrous, as we see here. And this is where I think a perceived unique particularity or peculiarity of Singapore's own approach to the post-natural holds a potential for the nomothetic, the reparative, and I hope the restorative. Thank you. I will stop there.